All right. Have you guys used Zoom before?
No.
No?
Nope.
Okay. Cool. I like Zoom because it allows us to have a really interactive experience. And oftentimes when I'm doing webinars, there's a classroom setting. So it actually allows me to see my audience just like I'm in a classroom. So so we'll go ahead and get started.
Can you see us? Excuse me.
I can't see you, no.
I can see our camera.
Yeah.
Let me make sure that I have you. Yeah, so I just ask you to start the video. Wonderful. You have a wonderful ceiling. I love those lights. So funny. All right. So good. Thank you. So first of all, my name is Andre Koen, and actually I'm not too far down the street from you. I house out of my home office in Mounds View, and I'm a professor at Bethel University. I also was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County. I've been a high school teacher and a middle school teacher, and so this idea of educating people remotely is a part of just what I do. It's a way that I can replicate myself as much as possible. I do like hands-on, face-to-face kinds of things, so I appreciate being able to see your faces as we have this conversation.
If you call us, but you actually presented for us before you.
Oh, really? Oh, sweet. So it's like family.
Yeah, family.
So I'm curious as to what you were hoping to get out of this session. I'm just going to write some notes about what you were hoping to get from this session, just so I can help you get what you desired out of this workshop. So, what were some of the hopes?
I can start. I guess the couple different things that I saw was because we service different populations of age, staff, but also that our staff is all different ages also.
Okay. So just kind of recognizing what your staff is like, as well as the folks that you serve.
Yep.
Cool.
I think it's getting interesting as far as communicating in the workplace, because it's not just age differences, but it's also it used to be years ago everyone watched the same 4 TV channels and you kind of had something, but everybody has such varied interests, which is wonderful. But it's like sometimes it's kind of hard to even figure out where people are coming from, you know. Just kind of finding common ground.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I remember when everyone trusted everything that Walter Cronkite said. And now there are so many other choices for people to find their news. So, all right, cool. So really about finding common ground. All right. So can you see the presentation in front of you on the screen?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. So we're going to really talk about this idea of generations in the workplace. And on slide 2, you see that there are 3 people on sitting on a sofa. What do you notice about those 3 individuals? What are some things that, in terms of generations, stands out for you as you look at those 3 individuals?
Looks like a daughter, a mother, and a grandmother is what appears to be.
Yeah, so it appears to be kind of 3 generations of folks. All right. What else do you notice?
They have laptops.
Yep, all three have laptops.
Have different style clothes.
They certainly have different styles of clothes, right? The footwear is very interesting to me, right? The younger generation having kind of these open flip-flop, the older two generations having more kind of conservative shoes. Even their approach to having laptops seems to be indicative possibly of their generational background. So the young lady has her laptop open and ready to go. The mother seems to, you know, kind of be just holding it, and then the grandmother is like, you know what, this is a great tool, and I can't tell if how friendly she is with using that kind of technology, but it certainly doesn't seem that she's ready to use it at this point. And so I think it's interesting that when we talk about this idea of generations, we're really talking about the context by which people come from. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So let's talk about what is a generation. So context is everything. And context drives our cultural responses. Context changes. We must also be responsive to those changes. What people do, generations are all striving for safety, significance, and belonging. But they try to achieve those things in different ways because the context that they come from demands that they do those in different ways. And it's really, for us, particularly as public servants, it's important for us to recognize that there's a difference between being right and being effective. And so oftentimes, particularly in public service, we are right. But the core question is, are we being effective with either our policies, how we implement things, and what is actually determining our effectiveness? And oftentimes, I would say it is the community's response to what we're doing. It's very easy for us to become bureaucrats. And a bureaucrat is a person who makes the rules that benefit them. So they've been given some resources. They are responsible for something, and the bureaucrat is the one that benefits from that system. In goals around budgeting, around being responsible for resources, all that kind of stuff. So there's that, and I have this kind of running joke in terms of talking about generations, that at some point, men and women will use the same restroom at the same time. And a lot of people gasp when they think about that, or chuckle even. But whatever comfort or discomfort you feel about that, I want you to remember that, because that's the same discomfort that people felt about Black people and white people being in the same spaces, right? Being in the same swimming pools, being in the same restaurants. And so however we feel about what that future holds, we can't deny that is certainly a possible future. And so this idea of using the same restrooms, or these other kind of social separations, we may see in the future be undermined because of pragmatic rationales. It is interesting that certain coffee shops that I go to, they have gender neutral bathrooms, so men and women use those facilities, not at the same time, but they haven't designated a male or female. And I think when we talk about more about this generational pieces, we'll start to see how and why that might be. So let's continue on. So I did ask that that folks take out a piece of, I am asking rather, that people take out a piece of paper, and on this particular slide, there is this this thing that we call a genogram, or a family tree, or a family constellation. And what I'd like for you to do is, I'd like for you to recreate your family tree as best you can. So marriages and separations and remarriages, blended families, adopted families, all of those types or configurations of families are acceptable when you build your family tree. But I want you to go back 3 generations. So starting with your generation, so you and your siblings, and whatever relations are stem from those, so nieces and nephews, so forth and so on, to your grandparents, and then ultimately to your great grandparents, and all of their relations and siblings. So I'll give you probably about 2 or 3 minutes to kind of construct that. And if you don't know, you certainly can make stuff up, or you can just put in the name. If you don't know specific names, that's fine. You can just put their, in your family system, whatever their name is called, right? So if you could just do that for a couple of minutes. All right. So while you're doing that, I want you to think of, as you're putting that together, are there people in your family that get talked about a lot, either as very positive individuals or possibly negative individuals in your family? And I want you to put a star next to any of those individuals as you are developing your family tree or your family constellation. All right. Now with those individuals that you've starred, I want you to circle one of them. Just circle one of those folks. And it could be a positive person or a negative person, given how your family talks about them, right? And what I want you to think about is, what are the attributes that are attributed to that person? What are the attributes, either positive or negative? What are some of those attributes that are or attributed to that person? All right. My next question: at what time frame, or what age, or what time frame do you think that those attributes were developed? So what age was the person when you think that those attributes that they are currently known for were developed? Were they a teen? Was it during a particular time frame, like the 1930s, so forth and so on? All right, and then lastly, what was the context that they were in when those skills were developed? So were they in the United States? Were they outside of the United States? Were they in an urban area? Were they in a rural area? Were they in a suburban area? What was the geographic place where those skills developed, or those attributes developed? All right, so while you're finishing that piece, I want to just tell you a little bit about me and how I approach this idea of context being very important, context being everything. So I loved my grandmother. My grandmother passed. She's been gone probably about 5 years. And it's still a little sore for me. She was my person. I don't know if you have a person in your life that is your person, but my grandmother was my person. And she would play games with me. We would do, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this, paint by numbers. There used to be this phenomenon in the 70s where you would do these fancy oil paintings by numbers. And we would do those. She taught me how to play dominoes and Scrabble. Just a wonderful, wonderful woman. However, my grandmother had some idiosyncrasies that I didn't understand as a child. One of those, and I thought she was actually kind of gross from a kid's perspective, right? So it was already gross enough that she would make a peanut butter and Braunschweiger sandwich. I don't know if any of your people ever did that. But Braunschweiger is certainly I don't think it's a kid's taste, right? So so I thought that was odd, but she did other things. Like my grandmother would serve us breakfast whenever my siblings and I would stay over, and she liked having tea and English muffins. That was her thing. And so with her English muffins, she preferred preserves over jam and jelly. And so my grandmother would oftentimes open up the preserves, and there would be this gray fungus kind of stuff inside the thing. And what my grandmother would do is she'd take a spoon and scoop out that gray fungus and then continue to serve out of that jelly. And as a kid, I thought that was disgusting. Or she would do something like there would be cheese and it'd have little spots on the cheese. And instead of throwing the cheese away, my grandmother would cut off those pieces of mold and then serve the cheese, right? From a kid's perspective. It wasn't until her death, and I got to hear from her siblings and her great nieces and nephews what her growing up was like. And it explained for me how and why my grandmother acted and did some of the things that she did. And many of you probably have picked up on the nuances that I didn't get as a kid. Why was my grandmother compelled to scoop out that mold or cut that off the cheese? What was the compelling rationale for her?
She needed to save money. Didn't have a lot to go with.
Yep. So she was trying to save money. She didn't want to waste anything. But why? Where did this idea of saving come from, or not wasting? Where did that come from?
Things getting hard to come by. Great Depression.
Yeah. So my grandmother grew up in the tail end of the Great Depression. And so that explained to me why she had stacks of newspaper that she never read, why she would take the aluminum foil and save it and create these little balls of aluminum foil or try to reuse that aluminum foil. And explained a lot once I understood the context that she came from. And so as you look at your own family tree and you picked out that person that was either notorious or victorious, what themes do you start to see given this idea of context in that person's behavior as it manifested? Is there anything that pops up for you as you look at that, given the context that they're coming from?
I had a dad that grew up he was in World War II and was basically injured during the war. He grew up in the Depression. He had divorced parents back in a time when there weren't very many people that got divorced. And so that was kind of scandalous kind of thing. He was moved from household to household. there's a lot of stuff that creeps out with Elmer. He's notorious.
Yeah, yeah. And that, you know, I find it interesting that the greatest generation paid also the greatest price, right? So, yeah, and I know a number of people whose parents who lived through that developed particular ways of seeing the world, that they see patriotism a particular kind of way. They see being actionable and responsibility to the world in a particular kind of way. I also have friends and family who went through Vietnam, and they see patriotism in a different way than that greatest generation, or they feel that the social responsibility differently than that greatest generation. And so, why do you think I would have folks why would I have you look at your kind of family tree or your family constellation, given this conversation about generations? Why would I do that?
It's easier to pick up on some of those idiosyncrasies on people that you know.
So it's easier to pick up on those idiosyncrasies from people that you know. Why else? Okay, yeah. Understanding someone's context, does that allow one to have a bit more compassion for their behaviors? Yeah. And so when we start looking at these different generations, what I want us to see is both our differences and our commonalities, but really trying to understand what is the context that is actually driving that behavior. I have friends and family who abuse alcohol and drugs. And when I look at the life choices that they've made and the life opportunities that they've had, drugs and alcohol might actually make sense given the kinds of things that they've had to go through, right? And I'm not condoning the use of those things, but I am suggesting that if I understand people's stories, I have a glimpse into understanding them, right? So where people come from. So so that diagram that you just created is also called a genogram. And in social science circles, it's used to really have people think about family systems and how they're connected and why and what patterns keep repeating themselves within a family system. So we're going to move on and really talk about what are some of the key pieces that drive human behavior. And so what is it that people want? Well, I would suggest that Abraham Maslow talks about 5 or 7 hierarchy of needs. And those are great models, but I need something a bit more simple, something that I can remember. And what I would suggest to you is that people are all looking for safety, significance, and belonging. We're looking for safety, significance, and belonging. So first, significance suggests that I'm a person with purpose and power, so I can do something. I was born on purpose for a reason, and I can do something. The second thing is that we want to belong. We want to be connected with people who understand our purpose. We want to interact with people who respect our purpose or respect our identity and who we are. And then lastly, we want to be physically, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually safe to be in relationships with people who understand our purpose. So we're constantly looking for safety, significance, and belonging. A simple way to think about this is, why do kids join gangs? Well, it is my belief that they are looking for one of those 3 things, if not all 3, right? Why do we go to work? I would suggest that work offers us either safety, either significance, or a sense of belonging. Why do kids sag their pants? Because it actually offers them safety, significance, and belonging. So I grew up in a time where there were people who were sagging their pants, and then there was another group of people who were wearing their clothes backwards. because of this hip hop group called Crisscross, and they wanted to make you jump, right? But I find it interesting that the sagging pants phenomenon stuck where the wearing your clothes backwards didn't. And I would offer that it was because wearing your sagging your pants gave some folks significance, safety, and belonging, where wearing them backwards did not. Right? So so that's essentially what people want. And there's a short video about millennials and the phenomenon of wanting to be praised that I'll let you explore on your own. So I'll let you explore that on your own. It's just meant to be a joke and funny, but there may be some truths there, particularly as hiring managers and people who are working with some of our young people. It does seem that they want praise, but they didn't birth themselves. And that's one thing to remember about our younger generations and about all of our generations. None of us birthed ourselves, so we come out of a context. And so, well, we can talk about that in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of right versus effective in terms of the cycle of socialization. So in our early years, our friends and our families, though our early caregivers, give us everything that they know about the world. What do you think is the major problem with the gift that they give us?
Not always right.
Say it once more.
Not always right.
It's not always right. And they don't know everything, right? So our parents and family give us what they know, but the information that they give us is incomplete, right? And it's incomplete because they come out of a context. And so if I grow up in the Iron Range and I have a particular way of seeing Lutherans and relationships with Catholics, when I go to encounter a Muslim or a Pentecostal Christian, I don't have a frame of reference to necessarily understand where they're coming from or their religious practices. And so this question around what is right and what is effective really helps us focus on being goal-oriented. In that being right is typically not focused on goals, but focused on my upbringing, my background, the way I see the world. And so we know that in our early years, we get that biased history, we get missing history, we get fragmented history. And all of that is designed to socialize us into a certain set of behaviors. And socialization is simply learning how to act within a particular context, right? So I learn how to act in the Iron Range, or I learn how to act in my urban community. And that becomes, and as long as I'm able to function within that small band of behavior, then I'm effectively learning how to do that. So, growing up in an urban environment, I was not taught how to survive in the desert or in the Sahara. Why? Because that's not the context that I was in, right? So socialization is really based on the context that you're in. And then there are reinforcers of that cycle. So education systems, media systems, governmental systems reinforce the socialization of that context that you're in. And the ultimate goal of that is for people to internalize what is being taught. And so media is constantly drumming in what is acceptable in our society given our context until we own it. And then when we own it, when it becomes internalized, we become agents of that information, agents of that change. We monitor, we make sure people are doing what they're supposed to do. This is how you're supposed to act and that kind of stuff. And we become almost the policeman of that, of the socialization process. And then it becomes institutionalized, and then there are systems that continue typically in kind of, yeah, there are systems that continue that. But there is an opportunity for choice. And so when systems, so where does choice come in? When, I've been taught all this stuff, I see all this stuff in the world, my interactions have been this particular kind of way, this is what I know. When does choice come in? Choice comes in when we realize that what we've been taught, what we experience currently, what we know, no longer works for us. So I know that there are, so as my college students will say, back in the day, there used to be a name for Brazil nuts. The little wooden nuts that are probably about 2 inches long and hard, like an orange wedge. Are people familiar with that other term for Brazil nuts?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Cool. So back, my students will say, back in the day, that was an acceptable term to call them. But today, that's not an acceptable term, right? Even though some people still do it, because some people didn't even know that there was another name other than that one. But that's not an acceptable term today. And so when we think about this idea of context, we know that context is constantly changing. We know that that we have to be driven towards goals if we want to be effective, right? And so looking at what I grew up experiencing or knowing or interacting with is superficial at best when goals are what we should be driving towards, right? So any questions so far? Okay, cool. We'll keep going. So here's another video. Again, you can watch this at your convenience. You have access to the slides, so I'd encourage you to do so. But I just want to touch a little bit on this idea of context, right? So we talked about the Brazil nuts, and that what they were called or how people interacted with those nuts was somewhat contextual. So what is context? Well, context is simply the environment in which organisms and human beings adapt, live, and survive. And as you can see, dinosaurs are no longer here. Although there's an argument that birds are kind of the current manifestation of dinosaurs, but in terms of T-Rex and Velociraptors or those guys don't exist. And why is that? What's that?
Well, things got cold and they didn't adapt.
The context changed and they could not adapt, right? So that is a warning to us that as context changes, no matter what we think about it, if we don't figure out how to adapt to the changing context, then we may meet the same fate as the dinosaurs, either intellectually or physically. It is my argument that in terms of whether greenhouse gases are human-made or whatever, we need to progress in terms of our technology beyond just the fossil fuels, but also look for other forms of energy, just because that's what the future holds for us, right? So I think that's important. And so on another video, again, at your leisure, you can explore that. But I think it's also important to talk about this idea of intelligence, because people will ask or try to measure people's intelligence. And one of the things that I ask is intelligence for what, right? So IQ for what? And again, we're still talking about generations in the workplace. And so my parents talk about this magical tool that they used to use in their math and science classes. And this this magical tool. I still don't understand how it works, but the name of it was a slide rule. So they talk about this thing. So I don't know how that works. They also talked about learning how to use an abacus. And that's the beads, and they slide, and you can count, and all that kind of stuff. That stuff to me is magical. I have no idea how that stuff works, right? But for them in their context, that was a necessary tool. But today, I don't know that many people use slide rules or know how to use slide rules, and I certainly haven't seen anybody use an abacus other than for children's activities. So IQ for what? And so one way I think about that is if a New Yorker is landed in southern Minnesota on a farmer's plot of land, what would that farmer say about that New Yorker?
Holy moly.
Right? They call him a city slicker. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? What if that farmer is dumped in downtown Manhattan? What would the people in New York say about the farmer?
The country bumpkin, and yeah.
Yeah, green acres is the life for me, right? So in their respective contexts, do they have intelligence? Are they smart? Are there things that they can do? And I would argue, yes. But when they go into a different context, they may not appear to be as intelligent or smart or as able to. But given this secret ingredient, they can adopt or adapt. They can adopt the behaviors of or adapt to the behaviors in those new contexts. And what do you think that 4-letter word secret ingredient is? Starts with T and ends in I'm.
Time.
Right? So given time, they can interact with those environments differently. So let's talk a little bit about some of these kind of generational pieces, right? So I'm going to come back to another activity towards the end that'll be a personal assessment that you can use. So let's go down to. So here are some of the myths about generations, and there are 10 myths about generations, and you can find more in the article that's in this presentation if you want to get the citing, if you want to cite it or whatnot. But one is that generations are so different. So the first myth is that generations are different. The second is that the other generations have no respect. Number three, we can't trust them to get things done. 4, that they don't like authority. 5, that they like to gossip and overshare. Number 6, that they just love change. Number 7, that they have no loyalty. Number 8, they do what they want. Number 9, they can learn how to do things. And number 10, they don't want to do certain things. So as we look at this myth and we think about some of the concepts that we talked about before we even got to this myths page, what do you think undermines all of those myths? Or what are some tenets that we've already talked about that kind of debunk a number of these myths? Context, right? So context is important, particularly as it applies to these myths. What else is important? Okay, so traits, and what are these? What is each generation going after? There are 3 things that they're going after: safety, significance, and belonging. And given their context, they won't go after those things the same way, right? So to say that they don't have respect is not quite true. What would be true is that their respect may be different than the respect than how I was taught to show respect. So, as an example, I was taught to open doors for women, whether they asked me to or not. Right? I see a woman, I just open the door, and that was a sign of chivalry. Well, but in other contexts, that is a sign of chauvinism, as if someone can't. Right? So how do I know if I should open the door or not open the door, blah, blah, blah. So the first thing is to make sure that I have relationships. So the people that I have relationships, I don't have to guess because we have a relationship. But for strangers or people that I don't have relationships with, what do you think is the most competent thing I can do to engage them?
Smile.
Smile, certainly, you can smile. And then I ask, right? Can I get that door for you? I'm like, no? Okay, cool, I'm good, right? So what we have to recognize is that this idea that our generations aren't very different, that the contexts that we've grown up in propel us to see and act with the world a particular kind of way. The world after 9/11 is very different than the minutes before 9/11, right? And so I remember, and the world before the assassination of JFK is very different than the world after the assassination of JFK. The world before the assassination of Martin Luther King is a very different world than after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so we have to recognize that young people are developing in particular contexts that require specific interactions with the world. So when we say we can't trust them to get them done, what are we actually saying?
We can't get it done the way that we do it.
That's right. We can't rely that they'll do it just the way we will do it. So if we want to guarantee that, then what do we have to tell them?
Exactly how we want them to do it.
Exactly how I'm expecting them to do it, right? So there's that thing. This idea of they don't like authority. Well, to be quite honest, I don't think most people like authority. I've never seen a situation or heard of a situation, particularly from my police friends, where someone thanks them for pulling them over because they caught them speeding. So to say that this generation doesn't like authority or that one doesn't is disingenuous, because I don't think that many people like authority. But liking authority and how I show respect to authority is contextual as well. And so if I want people to show or demonstrate certain types of behaviors or skills, I have to show them or give them what my expectation is of those skills or those behaviors. Another one that I think is interesting, if we go down to number 7, if you look at number 7, no loyalty. These folks have no loyalty. Well, when I believe, and I'll go back to Walter Cronkite, I would suggest that he felt that Americans or the viewing public was very loyal to him. What was also true about Walter? What's that? Yeah, there were very few. There were 4 choices, and I don't even remember who the other people were on television because Walter was so popular. But now people have a lot more choices. So this idea of loyalty can also sometimes be a misnomer. My grandfather worked 35 years for one company. His choices were also limited to the companies that he could go to, right? So when we reminisce about the past, we have to be honest about what that was. And so people have a lot more choices. Companies operate a lot differently today than they did 30, 40 years ago when my grandparents were interacting, because they also had a different kind of methodology. I think 8, 9, and 10 are very interesting because it's true. People only do what they want. That's it. I can't make anybody do anything. And people don't do what they don't want. And so, as as city leaders, as people working with the community, our job really is to be the concept of being fishermen of men. We have to have the right bait that encourages people to not only do the right thing, but to want to participate in our systems. Um, our hiring practices, our interactions with people on a day-to-day basis, all of those things should encourage us to place the right bait that people want to be a part of our organization. And so as generations have changed, so has that bait, right? That bait has changed. And I mean men in the sense of humans, not just gender specific. Um, so on slide 21, if you want to know some very particulars about each of the generations and how their work style and what they look for in terms of interacting with the workplace, you can see that on slide 21. There's a video there, and I walk through each of the 4 generations that are there. But this is what, right at slide 22, I really want to focus on this because this is where we get awry in looking at generations. We sometimes expect people to deliver things that we haven't told them that we're expecting. And given that different generations see that differently, we have to be very clear about what our goals are. And so I think in working with any generation, and any cultural group for that matter, it becomes important that we're really goal directed. I was in a meeting and people were talking about being family. This needs to be a tight family. I would shy away from any of that kind of language because that family metaphor is not the same for everyone. And so I think it's more important that we be goal focused. So for each of the generations, we have to understand we have to be clear about objectives. We have to understand what the reward system is for them. And so for some folks, it is about significance. So making them feel important in their jobs is necessary. For other folks, it is belonging, having a sense of community, either in the workplace or that allowing them to connect with their community outside the workplace. And others, it is a sense of safety. So having security, understanding security in the sense of livable wages, security in the sense of having understanding a plan or direction that their career can go. I know one of the places that I worked in, I had a supervisor, and the supervisor said, look, I know, and there was a lot of turnover in this particular position. And my supervisor said, look, I know this is a stepping stone for you, that you're going to go off and do some amazing and wonderful things. But while you're here, what are some things that you would like to learn about? Or what are some things that you would like to explore while you're with us? And I will tell you that was so empowering to me that I actually stayed an additional 2 years longer than I was planning to, right? Because they actually were not only investing in me, but they were giving me skills that they knew that I would take to other places. I was talking with a young man, and he said, I want to be a speaker like you, and I want to do, what you do and whatnot. I said, great. I said, let's go to McDonald's and get you an application. And he was like, what? I was like, yeah, let's go to McDonald's, get you an application. He said, why? I said, you want to be like me, right? He was like, yeah. I said, then you have to do what I did. And he was like, well, what does McDonald's have to do with doing what you do? I said, you actually think McDonald's sells hamburgers, don't you? And he was like, well, don't they? I said, McDonald's does so much more than sell hamburgers. McDonald's is the number one or number 2 training institution of job employment skills on the planet. right? So if you so I was trying to share with him that there are skills that you can learn at McDonald's that will transfer to every other job that you'll ever have. And so that's how we need to approach these different generations. So the next few slides talk more about those objectives and how to be clear about them, and how to prevent mishaps in the workplace. But and so right at slide 26 are kind of the differences in generations. And I won't bore you with reading those to you. You can read those yourself. Yeah, at 26 are those differences and motivations and that kind of stuff. One thing I do want to talk about is this Generation Z, because this is a generation that is the culmination of everything that we've told our kids about the world, right? So Generation Z is our virtual generation. They have not known a world without technology. They haven't known a world without the internet. So they've heard us talk about equality. They've heard us talk about both gender equality and racial equality. They've heard us talk about the world being a fair and just place. And the interesting thing is, they believe us. They believe us, right? So I'm at we're at Smashburger, and my daughter is getting bored. She's 3 years old. She's getting bored, and so she says, "Okay, Google, turn on the Octonauts in the living room." So we're at Smashburger. What's the problem with what my daughter's doing? They don't have Google at Smashburger. But at our home, my daughter can talk to the internet. The computer will manifest what she's talked about on the television, right? So her adaptability to technology, her use of technology is far greater than anything that I had because of the context. But she also believes me about what we've said about the world. And so one of the things that we'll see with Generation Z, whether they understand all the nuances of things or not, but they really do expect and interact with diversity differently than all the previous generations. Whether they know how to respect it or interact with it, they expect to. It's not a surprise to see diversity in certain contexts, or at least to have diversity conversations about commonalities and differences. And so that's something in our workplaces that we have to recognize and manifest. The other thing is this idea of gender identity and gender expression and sexuality. Our young people, again, have believed what we've told them, that we're equal, that we're there's no difference between us, that humans are humans and all that good stuff. And so when that manifests, we have to be prepared to actually deal with what we've told them, with the recognition that they're looking for safety, significance, and belonging, even in ways that we don't necessarily understand or may even agree with, right? So our agreeing with how they're expressing themselves has nothing to do with their willingness or their ability to do it. And so here's a picture of Will Smith's son, Jaden Smith. He was Vogue's top model for a while, in different kinds of apparel. And whatever we think about that has little to do with how he has conceptualized what the world has taught him about being an individual or being a part of whatever group he wants to. You can be whatever you want to be. That's the mantra we've given our kids. And they've actually taken that on and they believe us, right? So last couple of things, and I think our time will be kind of winding up, is I wanted to talk. Oh, let me go back up because I want to talk about this idea of looking at context, right? So context is the environment. So in our workplaces, how do we engage these generations? Well, I like using the carrot metaphor in terms of talking about cultures of organizations, because there's the top of the carrot and then there's the bottom of the carrot. The top we'll call the stem, and the bottom we'll call the root. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the top and the root. They need each other, right? So the top takes in nutrients from the sun and feeds it to the bottom, to the root, and the root takes in the moisture from the ground and feeds it to the top. So they need each other. So in our organizations, if we're going to look at how we interact with these generations differently, it's important to recognize what our core values are, and that the roots of the carrot are symptomatic, are the emblems or the meat, the core of our values and our organization, and that the top is the fruit of that, right? So I'll be able to. So if I want to appreciate or show that I'm interacting with generations differently, then I have to actually have different generations in the place. If they're in my organizations, if they're looking for diversity as a hallmark of acceptance or interaction, then I have to show that there's diversity in my place, not only just in personnel, but in all of the iconography that shows up. The use of technology and how that is used and why that is used has to be one of those things that's manifested as an artifact coming out of my core values. So so there is that, and ultimately we have to go beyond just looking at our individual kind of concepts and really look at this idea of family versus team. And what we want to do is we really want to focus on being goal-oriented and being team-focused. So no matter what generation you're coming from, there are some specific goals that we want to meet. Now, how you get to those goals or how you interact with those goals is either up for discussion, or you can use it however you want. But there are certain things that are goal focused that no matter what your generation, we have to do. So an example is being on time, right? So whatever you think that means for you, or whatever context you're coming from, I need you here at 9 o'clock. That's not, if you can't be here at 9 o'clock, that's not a generational issue. It's a goal-focused issue. Now, how you get here at 9 o'clock, that's on you, right? But there are specific goals that we have to be focused. We have to also, I would suggest that we shy away from relationship building to productivity. So your interactions, how do those interactions produce results, or what results do they produce? Another thing to kind of think about is this idea of time on task versus task accomplishments. So sometimes, particularly I've worked in places where they want to see me sit at my desk as opposed to not seeing me and seeing the results of my tasks, right? So, and I know that those types of ways of looking at the world are contextual, and there are certain jobs that you have to be seen. But if we can actually move to task accomplishment, some generations don't necessarily, as an example, meetings, and there's a video in here that talks about meetings too, right? So what is the purpose of meetings? Are there different kinds of ways of doing meetings? what does a meeting look like? What are the agendas? How does that happen? And because some generations are like, there are different ways to do meetings than just face to face. And then we also have to move to this idea that everything that we're doing should be mission driven or mission focused, as opposed to off purpose behavior. So if if people have individual idiosyncrasies, how do we manage those idiosyncrasies? But are you, as a person with those idiosyncrasies, are you really focused on what the mission of the organization is? And we have to recognize that organizational development is a good form of self-care, right? So if we're able to get people to look at mission-driven organizations and drive people towards those goals, that their contribution is a good form of self-care. So there is that. And then lastly is a discussion guide. And I suggest that in small circles and in that space that you're in, that you go through that discussion guide and ask those core questions around what or how do you value generations in your workplace, and what does that mean to value generations in your workplace, and what currently makes up your workplace. And those questions in that discussion guide, and you can see a link right here, will really help you to create a plan of action that doesn't that actually leads you to creating an environment that is a productive environment for all those generations. And the last thing I'd like to offer is that these generational differences, the first part, so about 10 years ago, I was talking with a lot of managers about how to work with millennials. In many cases, the tables have turned that I'm talking with millennials about how to work with Gen Xers and how to work with baby boomers, because many of those millennials are now the supervisors that have to understand traditionalists, that have to understand the previous generations. And so recognize that those shifts oftentimes happen. And so communication has to go, it has to be very circular in our systems. Cool. So are there any questions for folks? Has this been helpful?
I think so. For sure.
Great. So like I said, there's the discussion guide document there. I'd encourage you to watch the videos. I didn't want to belabor your time with that and the technology, but you have access to this workshop. We'll also be doing this with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. So if you have other folks that would like to participate in that session, that's coming up, and we'll be offering other sessions. If there's some other things that you're interested in, please send me an email. You can write me at andre@amhorizons.com, and we'll continue doing series like this as we move forward. Any questions, comments, observations?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, good. Well, thank you. You guys are a very attractive audience, and this was a pleasure. So have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All righty.